When you're mixing metal music, what are the sort of limitations and trade-offs that you're looking for? In other words, with denser, thicker guitar tones, it makes the drums harder to punch through, or with less distortion, it's a less thick sound. What are those sort of trade-offs you're looking at?
A lot of it is, again, just starting with the material. You got to start with the song and okay, what are the focal points of the particular song? What areas of the mix should be highlighted more than others? What is driving the song? You know, if it's a very rhythmic song and the drums are really pushing things forward, then those need to make sure they're punching through. But I mean, in the end of the day, really everything needs to be punching through no matter what. So it kind of, you know, it's like a multi-step process of just kind of digging in, getting the fundamentals in place to where you kind of have like workable tones for everything. And then sort of the creative side kicks in, and it's more like shaping the song to appeal to the listener in the right form.
Sure. Yeah. And does your general approach with bussing change from project to project? We were chatting about this earlier about, we were talking about Machine's approach with the outside bus, and there's the instrumental bus and, you know, vocal bus. Do you have a general template approach as far as your bussing?
I guess a workflow would be more appropriate. I wouldn't say I start from a template, because I think that can kind of hinder the process and stagnate, you know, myself as a mixer. So I try and let myself be free to discover new tricks rather than just sticking with like the tried and true. So I don't stay stagnant. But I definitely do have a workflow as far as a grouping and kind of signal path method that I do mostly stick to. And it just changes when necessary, you know. So drums go to individual groups and then to a drum bus, and then to the master bus. So they all kind of have like the signal flow that works for me.
And obviously it'll vary from project to project how you use your parallel compression and distortion and saturation. But as far as parallel compression, is it something that you'll use on the drums for every project, or every project but in varying degrees?
Probably the second. Yeah, like lately, and these are things that also could change. You know, for the past few years, I've been using parallel compression on drums on just about every project, but to varying degrees. Similar settings, because I'm using hardware, and it's to avoid having to recall, you know, a bunch of settings for every single project. I kind of find where I like, you know, a certain piece of gear doing a certain type of thing, and then just go to it for that time and time again. It makes things a little easier in like a modern studio context. But yeah, then you know, that feeds back into the project on its own fader, and that's always going to be a varying part of the sound depending on what the project calls for.
Sure. And what is your approach? Is it generally that you'll look at, here's a parallel compression for the snare, and here's one for the kick, and maybe one for the toms, or is it here's one that's for the kick and snare? And I know it'll vary from project to project. Here's you know, kick and snare parallels, or
it's kind of I have a piece of gear, and I figure out what about it that I like, and then I utilize it for that sound. So most of parallel compression for me is for that snap. So like two of the more common ones I'll use is a Compex, and then an Audioscape decomp, and they both have a similar but slightly different kind of snap, and that's what I'm trying to get out of them. So I load them up, and then I just send to it whatever I want some of that flavor. And if I need more snap on the snare, then I'll just send more snare to it. So rather than it being a specific you know, processor for an instrument, it's just a processor for a sound, and the parallel side allows me just to kind of dip into it whatever I want, rather than having it isolated on one instrument. And it also sort of, all of the parallel compression combined helps me with that glue. So it almost acts as like a drum bus compressor, since a lot of the drums end up going to these compressors, and together they add some of that glue and reactiveness between the different instruments.
Sure. And is it an approach where you'll go for different attack and release times with different compressors? Like one's really taking a fast attack, fast release approach, so it really looks more for sustain, and then another one that's more about the punch.
Precisely. And then that gives me kind of faders to control those elements of the mix, where if I feel like I need a little more air behind the hit, or if I need a little more bloom on the toms or on the snare, I can push up that fast attack, fast release one, and it maybe gives me a little bit of snap, because all of my compressors are going to give me a little bit of snap, but then brings up some of that air around that almost acts as like a drum room in parallel with the drum room. Or if I feel like I need a little more excitement and I want to give the drummer like 10,000-pound arms, that's kind of how I think of like the snappier compressors. Is it just kind of makes him sound like he was hitting about 10 times harder, and adds a lot of excitement to the mix. And then you can even vary it per part, if you find that necessary. I don't often do that, I wouldn't say, but it's definitely possible.
And continuing with the theme of workflow, do you generally start off with master bus processing as far as a little bit of compression and limiting, or is that something you'll leave till later in the process?
It's kind of somewhere in the middle. So I'll start with the clean mix bus, and then I'm doing a lot of like solo tone listening, sculpting things like, okay, let me just hear the vocals. Okay, like what do I know needs to come out right away? And at the earlier stages, I'm almost always listening for what I don't like, and I'm removing that. And if I'm going to augment drums with samples, then I'm going to maybe figure those out first. Okay, let's find some samples that feel like they're sort of at home with these natural drums, blend well, take care of the phase, all of the details. Like the first part of the mix is a lot of technical stuff. Just getting things in place. Like, okay, everything sounds kind of good on its own now, but by the time I'm using those kind of prepared tones to sculpt a mix, then I'm going to want some processing on the mix bus. Probably not a lot of EQ, but set up, some of my virtual console type things, which add a little bit of that saturation. I'll probably get some limiting on there, although I won't hit it too hard yet because I don't really know where all the headroom is quite yet. Start adding some of the color type items, like I'm a big fan of the Slate virtual tape on the mix bus. I feel like it adds a nice bloom to the low end. I know that's kind of like a love it or hate it type of thing, but I like starting with that fairly early, and I can mix into it and allow it to just like provide that fundamental, like kind of push that forward a bit. But it's not something you can add too late, because it can ruin a mix if you just toss it on when your balances are already in check. So it's kind of like nothing at first, and then I start stacking some things on, and then by the time I have everything in there and I'm really looking to fine tune everything and glue it together, I need to have a pretty stacked mix bus. And I typically, in most scenarios, I'm mastering the project too, so by the time that I'm at the end of a session, I'll have a full mix and mastering chain on my mix bus that I'm mixing through at the very end.
And then going back to the beginning of that process where you're talking about looking at drum samples that'll work with the original tones, do you have any general approaches where you like to take clean hits from the kit used for tracking and create drum samples from those? Or
that's a case-by-case thing too. It sort of depends on the sound required. If I've worked with a few drummers who have a very specific sound and specific style that rely on their drums and tune the way they tune. In that case, I'm going to lean more heavily on samples created from the kit, from the session. And obviously that allows me to keep a unified sound, but then I gain a little more control over dynamics because I can obviously control the velocity of those samples. So it really depends, case-by-case thing. I would say it's probably 30% of the time I'm using samples from the recorded session, and the rest of the time I'm just utilizing obviously those live sounds because they still exist there, and I feel like if I'm producing the drums or recording drums as well, I could probably get what I need out of those drums in the live performance. So if I need more consistency, I can just get that out of the drummer when we're tracking, and then I'm looking to augment those sounds with slightly different sounds later using samples to get something that the live kit didn't really provide that I feel is necessary.
Sure, and from that perspective, is it generally that you look towards more ambient samples or ambient and dry samples and then look at different feed levels?
Yeah, it's probably that. Yeah, if I feel if say we tuned with a higher pitched snare, for instance, and that's great for the reactivity of the parts, and that's what the drummer feels most comfortable with as far as like getting a proper bounce. Cool, but then it gets to the mix and I feel like I'm missing some weights. You know, I really like a weighty snare. Even for higher pitched snares, I really want some weight to come through. So maybe I'll look to a sample to add that weight. And then if I feel it needs more room, then I can also use, you know, it's just really whatever the project calls for. And it's always kind of different. So that's why I like having a workflow that I'm comfortable with, where I know everything, where everything is in the mix and in the signal path, but really just letting the song guide you rather than just kind of like having a set workflow as far as like, okay, this is how I actually treat each instrument. You really just need to let the song tell you what it needs, and you just follow that.
Absolutely. And with the kick drum, it's a similar same kind of like similar circumstance in that you'll potentially use a kick sample from the kit used for tracking from the session, and then use different samples for the different qualities you get.
For sure. Yeah. Mostly like on kick drum, it's always going to be looking for a little more consistency. You want to have a little bit of that natural dynamic from a real kick drum, because it's like, even if the volumes are completely unified, a hard hit sounds different than a soft hit, even if they're the exact same volume. In a kick drum, there's a huge difference. You know, the amount of attack, the amount of smack, the length of the bloom after the kick. So you want some of that stuff, but in a dense metal mix with like a wall of guitar and bass and vocals and other elements, consistency isn't always there with only the natural kicks. So you use a sample to like, okay, let's give me some consistent fundamental low end, some consistent attack, you know, and you can even vary that with how closely it tracks the drummer's natural velocities. Sometimes I'll have it match them almost perfectly if it's like more an open mix and there's more room for that. Or if it's really fast stuff and the natural dynamics are more, you know, like if you're playing, you know, 30-second notes at 280 BPM, there's only so hard there's only so hard any drummer can hit those kicks. So then I'm going to utilize a sample, just push those forward a little bit more.
Sure. And then last couple of questions on your general workflow. Are you generally favoring looking at, for example, sending your acoustic snare and the snare samples to a collective snare bus with the acoustic and the samples, and you'll use that as the takeoff point for sends to reverb? Or do you do the Andy Wallace thing where it's more the samples that are sending to reverb, or is it sometimes a mixture of both, or again, is it just dependent?
So it's definitely a staggered approach. So typically I'll have more than one snare mic, a top and a bottom almost always, and then sometimes two tops and a bottom. So those will go to a single group called snare mics. And then my samples will go to another group called snare sample. Both of those will feed to a master snare group. So they have different points to apply processing where I need it. And typically that master snare group will be where the reverb sends. So I'm using just the combined full snare sound. That master snare group will then go on to like the drum bus. So it's kind of like a staged approach, and allows me to put processing efficiently. So if I say want to add EQ to the natural snare, I can add it to the group rather than all three or two or however many individual instruments I have. But then only dial in that natural snare sound, not the sample sound, and then together those go to another one, and then I'm usually applying more processing there in stages. So
sure.
Yeah.
When you first looked at the In Solitude session, what did you do? Did you just have a listen to all the tones and the sounds, and, you know, obviously set up your session and sort of like having a listen through, and did you just sort of like go left to right across the board, starting with the drums, or?
Pretty much, yeah. The first thing I do is just kind of give myself like a real basic faders up mix so I can hear the song, kind of poke through the song a little bit. Honestly, probably didn't even listen all the way through. I get a good idea of what I'm dealing with. In Solitude in particular is a long song. It's got a few different feels, goes through some different ranges, different tempos. So I try and get an idea of like where I'm going to want the final product. And then once I kind of get a overview of the song and I kind of start to have a bit of a direction, then really it's just like a bunch of technical kind of setup stuff. I'm going through each track, you know, on this particular track, there are a few different snares. I think there's 2 snare tops, a bottom, and a snare side, for instance. So I'm like, okay, do I want to use all these? And what amounts I'm going to want to use them. So it's just like at that point, it's kind of methodical and almost like, you know, my brain shuts off and I just like kind of go through it in a process that I've just done a million times at this point. And then once I get through that is kind of when that creative side kicks back in, and then I'm making more mixed decisions. Okay, like I got things set up, pretty comfortable with everything. I kind of have a smaller amount of groups in front of me that are a little more manageable than, you know, 50 or 60 individual tracks. So it allows me to kind of like zero in on the larger elements of the mix and do most of my work on those.
Sure. And on that process where you're putting it together, do you generally favor waveform edits on your toms and gating the kick and snare mics pretty hard, or do you go for limited range gating? Or
I do essentially limited range gating, but my particular method uses MIDI. So I trigger samples off MIDI, and I also trigger my gating off MIDI. And I use I actually use FabFilter Pro MB, which is a multiband compressor, and I use it as an expander, and it's gating off of ticks that are again generated live with MIDI. And it allows me to gate all the drums in a pretty natural way. And the multiband aspect of it allows me to control cymbal bleed by setting the high end of, say, a tom track to a faster release time that kind of just matches the feel of the song, while letting the low end bloom a little bit longer, because that's not as problematic on a tom track. Cymbal bleed's like one of those things that anyone who's ever mixed a song ever with real drums is pulling their hair out, trying to deal with that. Like, that's what happened to me. But and it allows me to kind of do it in a more natural way, where it's kind of just tucks in the mix, and I get that initial snap from a tom hit, for instance, but then kind of ducks out of the way fast and lets the low end bloom a little bit longer.
Sure. So in this project, I think I gave you all the ticks for the different kicks and snares, but
yeah.
do you use like Massey DRT or something like that?
Yeah, so actually, like these days, luckily my badass assistant, Mr. Michaelo, does most of that for me. But we use Slate Trigger to generate the MIDI. I feel like it tracks the dynamics pretty well. It always requires a little bit of manual editing. You got to make sure things are in phase. And because I rely on it so much, it's not only triggering my gating, but also controlling the samples. It needs to be pretty phase accurate. You know, you can't have a snare sample kind of drifting back and forward with a natural snare. You're definitely going to hear that kick same. So it requires a little bit of nudging, but we have our workflow pretty dialed in for that stuff. And then the nice thing about having everything running live off MIDI, it keeps stuff malleable through the entire stage. So especially when I'm producing, maybe we want to change a kick drum pattern, you know, as we're printing final mixes. Like, oh, this would really slam if we add this one upbeat, you know, kick here, and I can go in and add that sample. It's going to add that MIDI note rather. It's going to trigger the sample, and I'll have to copy over an acoustic drum in that same spot, but it's also going to open those gates as well. So I like, rather than having printed, you know, audio ticks, I like running everything live off MIDI so it stays malleable.
Sure. And when you listen through to the multi-track, what became your sort of primary focus with the song? Because obviously there's, you know, blast beats and there's the slow middle section. Yeah. What were you kind of like at that stage thinking, this is going to be a challenge with this song? Or what were your thoughts about, you know, I'm going to need a lot of automation or...
The main, I guess I kind of split it up into 2 sections, which would be like the beginning and the end of the song, which kind of have a consistent feel, and then that middle section in the middle with a lot of orchestration. That's kind of like the curveball thrown in. Luckily, they're not so divergent that require completely different mixes or completely different tones, but it's something you're going to want to keep in mind. Like the middle section gets a little slower and churnier and weightier, so I know I'm going to want drum tones that can carry that weight, can have a little bit of length to them. I also like automated in some additional reverb for that section to give that section some more space and to feel a little more grand, because that's kind of the feel it has already. You know, my approach to mixing is, okay, let's listen to the arrangement. How does that make me feel? what choices can I make in the mix to just embellish those emotions, and just like you're just there to enhance what the song already is, you know. And mixing stage is just lipstick on the pig situation. So you just want to take what's there and release it, I guess, for an audience.
Yeah, sure. And with from the width perspective, are you going cymbals fully wide and the guitars fully wide, or do you have any stereo widening techniques on the bass or in the mix overall?
Typically, I don't on bass, but yeah, I'm going to usually pan hard left, hard right on overheads. There's enough bleed already, and they're all mics on the same instrument, so panning 100% left and right, will still leave you a little bit of crosstalk. Typically the ride, I'll move in a little bit. That's one of the only things that I feel like when you just really hard pan the ride and it's such a bright attack, it can be a little off-putting. So I'll bring the ride in. Guitars are always gonna almost always go hard left and hard right. On some maybe more commercial stuff, maybe sometimes you bring them in for the verse, just so you can pop them out for the chorus for a little extra lift. But on a song like this, they're just gonna be hard panned all the way, yeah.
So with your kick drum, did you completely replace the kick on this one, or did you use an element of the acoustic mics at the same time?
There's a blend, actually. The kick drum sound was pretty good, and I liked the dynamic nature of it. So yeah, there's a blend, and you can see there's a little more processing on the kick mics, just because it generally needs it. You know, samples by nature, many of them that I choose are already processed, so they're kind of ready to go. But yeah, so here would be the live gate that I'm running, and you can even kind of see. Can see how the top end releases a lot faster. It's a lot more reactive to each hit, while the low end's a little slower, allows it to bloom a little bit more. Yeah, and then just some EQ, some drum leveling. I've been utilizing this guy lately. Was pretty fun.
Yeah.
That's just kind of like it's not really compression. It's just re-leveling each hit.
Yeah.
Using it pretty hard on kick drum, typically a little bit less aggressively on snare and toms. But I find that using some of the drum leveler before it hits a color compressor, which I am using here in this SSL channel, allows the compression to react a little more consistently to those hits, because it's seeing a more similar level, so you're getting a similar level of snap, you know, out of the compressor, which is really what I'm using this SSL channel for.
So it's not on the multi-band compression there. It's sort of, it's not actually gating it, is it, or is it gating it?
It is gating it. Well, it's like set as an expander. So
Yeah.
So with the range of both of these are set to 20 dB.
Yeah.
So if let's see here, we can just if I can get this out of the way, I'll just solo the kick mic.
Yep.
And then we can see what this is doing. It feels really natural, and allows me to kind of sculpt it a little bit different for every project, you know,
Sure.
depending on the bleed levels and how fast the performance is and whatnot.
And was it all three of the microphones that I gave you on the kick drum, or did you just use one of them?
Well, why don't we look and see? Yeah, so we are using all of them here, and I typically, this is what I will do. It's like the D6 is my main track. You can see the faders at the highest there, and then I'll use that as my like central kick sound, and then I may apply some processing to the additional tracks so they're augmenting what I want out of that main track. So the sub kick, I think I probably went in and just took all the top end out, so I'm really just getting the bloom. And at this point, anytime you're doing processing to different sources on the same instrument, you got to be aware of phase, specific on something like kick drum, because the low end is where you hear that phase the most. So one of the few cases where I'm going to use a natural phase EQ, just to make sure that I'm not losing anything there. And even then, sometimes I won't. It's really a case-by-case basis, because it's probably getting a little too technical, a little too nerdy, but there are some downsides with pre-ringing to using linear phase processing in a DAW. And then, let's see, just took out a bit of that notch of the Beta 91, because they can sound a little door knocky, so sculpting those to augment what I want out of my main source. So stacked approach, so like these get a bit of processing and then they go over to this group track where I'm doing like a lot more, some like heavy lifting EQ, like making my Picassos over here on Pro Q3, and then more extensive stuff.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And you're using auto-align. So yeah, I mean, sound radix. I love the sound radix stuff. Like drum levels, great, and auto-align. And you're phase aligning all 3 kicks, are you?
So I'm not, because the mics felt pretty in phase to me, or at least I was happy with their phase relationship. But I will use it between my kick mics and my kick sample, because different samples, and also you're just dealing with like DW, delay compensation. You never really know what's going on under the hood. And since I'm not printing my samples, if I were, you can just zoom in and visually see if they're in phase. Since I'm running them live, I'll typically use auto align on my samples. So you can see a few of these groups, like these are my kick sample, the same on the snare. And then I've auto aligned all of my bass tracks just to make sure those play nice together. And auto align 2 in particular is really useful. It's actually doing some pretty crazy stuff on these. If you look at the little color band here, it shows you how it applies different phase adjustments at different frequency points, which for multi-mic'd guitar sounds, like if you've got a few different mics on a cabinet, can be a game changer versus just pure time alignment or phase alignment. So it's a little bit of there's a little bit of uneasiness that comes with using tools like that, because so much happening behind the scenes, and it's not like you really have control over every aspect of it. But in almost every case, it ends up making it sound better. So yeah, phase is one of those things that it's like a love-hate for me. I just wish with all of my being that it didn't exist, and it would be something we never had to worry about, because in a lot of situations, there's not a right or wrong with phase.
No.
Yeah.
Have you used Pi, Sound Radix Pi?
I have once, and I think my issue with it was because it's constantly adjusting. I felt like I could hear it when I'm listening to a source. To like, say if I'm using it on drum overheads or guitars, it's always trying to. I think, am I correct? That's the one that's like always adjusting. I feel like if I just listen to it, I can hear it adjusting, and I'm just getting slightly different phase relationships as the song goes on, and it's just not reliable enough for me. I'd rather just have something that I can dial in, and it stays static once it's set, and then I just don't have to worry about our AI overlords trying to ruin my mix.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And did you just go with the 1 kick sample on this one?
I have 1 track, but I'm probably blending a few. Yeah, so a couple of these. Some of my own, here's one I bounced from a project I did in 2019, obviously. Another one that I did here and just late last year. And then a few, I think the Cheek Slap is our good friend Jens Bogren's kick sample. So yeah, just kind of a collection, I've got a few that I like, but then it's mostly a matter of bringing up the natural mics once I have something sort of dialed in there, and then just trying out samples. And sometimes I'll pull them both up and just solo the kick and the sample, and I'll pan them a little bit. And then I kind of just am trying different samples until I'm like, okay, these are sort of starting to come together. Maybe gives me a clue that they'd work well together. And I'm typically not doing a lot of tuning of samples. I'd rather just find samples that work together naturally, but I know other guys that'll either try and match tune using just like the tune knob here on whatever they're running samples on, or I think a common tool is Waves Torque, which is like specifically made for tuning percussive instruments, and has some way of separating the attack from the sustain. Some voodoo magic back there. I've played around with it a little bit, but I typically just don't mess with that too much.
Sure. Yeah. Can we have a listen to your acoustic kick mic and then the kick sample and then blended together?
Absolutely. Let me let's find a just consistent section here. Give us a couple of measures.
Cool.
So those together, you know.
And some nice ambience in that kick sample.
Yeah.
There's something sounding really nice there. Yeah. And can we just have a look at the EQ you're applying to the kick sample channel?
Certainly. So again, there's probably not much. Let's solo it. And just really taking out some knock. I think I'll play a little bit and then turn this EQ on and off. Yeah. It's just a bit knocky. And really some of this probably has to do with the processing I have on the master kick channel here, which I'm gonna guess is, cutting some loads and some 200. And then one of these might be adding some. Actually, it's not really. They're all kind of like just sculpting some of the mids. So the samples, I guess, are just a little mid-heavy, which maybe works in another context, but in combination with this natural kick sound and this mix, I just need a lot less mids. So it's really putting them up together and then just making sure they're kind of similar sounds, I guess, you know?
Sure, and then you got a bit of true iron on there just to give it a bit of coloration.
Yeah, just a little squish on the low end. I really like how this kind of gives you that transformer push on the bottom end. So for kick and snare, sometimes toms, then I use a little bit on the mix bus. It's one of the more subtle processors, which I think makes me like it more. Especially something like this, you don't want to be too heavy-handed and just puke color all over your mix. You just want it to add little bits here and there. So.
And a bit of transient design.
Yeah, I feel like this one is being used pretty subtly. So yeah, just a bit of sustain, a little punch. This has kind of been my favorite transient designer lately. It's usually this one or the UAD version of the
SPL?
Yeah, the actual SPL transient designer. But I've been leaning towards this one. I like it. Gives you some options for attack speed on the punch circuit, and then kind of gives you some crossover points for where you want it to focus on low end, high end, and how much of each. I'm not a fan of this like 90s hi-fi GUI, but it sounds good, so that's what matters.
Absolutely. And then moving on to the snare mic, obviously there were two snare tops. I gave you a snare bottom and a snare side. What were your decisions about the...
Let's look and see. It looks like I'm using a little bit of everything. And I remember specifically kind of blending in the snare side, and it's been years since I myself have put a snare side mic up, but I quite enjoyed this one. It just kind of gives you a little ambience, it's a little bit like a room mic. So yeah, I'm using them all a bit here. And again, I didn't really phase align. I'm assuming that my assistant mic did a pass of phase aligning the snare, so here he's gonna get called out. But that looks pretty good. Like if I zoom in on these waveforms right there, that's pretty good. They're reacting pretty similar. By the time I get a prepared project, I would assume that all of the mics have already been treated for phase. So then I mainly just have to worry about phase between those and the samples that I add. And then any phase relationship changes that happen with processing, which again, it's just another can of worms that you get into when you go deep with phase. But I did use all of them, and they're probably gated pretty heavy. And I think on this particular track, I ended up splitting it up into 4 bands to really control how much bleed I'm getting. And another thing you can do using the multi-brand expansion method is control the feel of your ghost notes. So it allows you to kind of use a threshold on this expander, which is kind of like the gate threshold, and dial in how much of those ghost notes you want to come through. Because if it's hitting heavy compression afterwards, you don't want those ghost notes to sound unnatural, like unnaturally loud. So in this case, particularly on the top end, you can see like the threshold is a little lower on these lower bands. On the top end, it's just up a little bit higher to make it less reactive to those ghost notes, so they don't open up and expose tons of bleed to the mix.
Fantastic. And the EQ approach, were you EQing individually or on the sum?
It looks like I did a little bit. So again, the same type of situation where I'm going to find my main source, and it's probably not going to have much processing, and then I'm going to apply a little bit to the other sources to augment that main source. Kind of just like, I guess that's like almost like a top-down way of dealing with an individual instrument. I find what I like the most. Okay, this has a good balance, and then I'm bringing the other things in, and if I find aspects of them that don't play as well with what I want to be my main source, then I'll sculpt those sounds at that point. So that was a condenser, just pulling. Sometimes condensers on snare can get a little too snappy, and they can get a little like almost strange type of low end on the impact, so I'm cutting all that out because it's nothing I need, and then just pulling some mids out because it just that condenser was a little more mid heavy. And then probably similar stuff for the snare bottom, just controlling some of that fizz so the snare wires aren't too like ultra top endy. And I actually like to utilize some of the low end from a snare bottom mic, which I don't think a lot of guys do. So I'll leave my high pass pretty low and not cut too much down there and get a little bit of body out of that snare bottom as well.
And then you're hitting virtual tape machines and then virtual mix rack on it?
Pretty much across the board on almost every channel. It hits a little bit of VTM and then like a Slate 4K E channel here, and I kind of crank the drive. And this is something that works for me, and I think why I've landed on this approach is because naturally my ear goes towards cleaner sounds. I think I'm always looking for stuff that I don't like, and I'm trying to remove. And I find that adding this like stacked saturation element helps me still have a nice full mix, where maybe earlier in my career, some of my mixes could have been a little more on the sterile side, because that's just what I prefer. Naturally, I'm always looking to like bring up the clarity. So I'm kind of like compensating for my natural tendencies by stacking this saturation to kind of squish everything together. And I just really like a nice, crunchy, squishy mix that feels like it kind of wraps around you, like they were in the heyday, I suppose.
Sure. And then you've got any EQ and processing on the acoustic snare sound?
I'm sure I've got a ton. Yeah, that's usually something I'm going to hit a lot. So I think I was moving pretty quick on this mix, so there's probably some pretty wild looking EQ curves like this. Pulling a lot of that 500, that's like, you do this long enough, you learn the key points for each instrument. For snare, it's going to be a certain amount of high passing. You're really going to want to control the 500 on a natural snare to get that like cardboardy knockiness out. And then for most natural drums, I'm going to do some high passing, like way up top, somewhere in this range, to keep the like crisp, kind of fake sounding, digitally feeling sound out. And then, just shaping from there. And like, I think I have multiple levels, like 2 EQs doing, like, honestly, this is pretty messy. I could probably combine all this into a much cleaner curve. But when I'm mixing, sometimes it's just like, full go. And I'm not too worried about being clean. And I use a lot of points and just to kind of create like a shape I'm looking for,
And is any of that dynamic EQ?
Not on snare, not right now. I will utilize, I'm trying to remember where I use some dynamic EQ. I know there's some on the, so this is my master bus for the production elements and the synth elements. And with any kind of synth or electronic stuff, the low end can easily get out of control. So I have a quick dynamic low shelf to kind of keep that in check. But I probably don't lean on the dynamic stuff too much, because sometimes I feel like it's just a little too unpredictable. I kind of want to know what I'm dealing with and just be very careful and deliberate with when I apply those dynamic processors.
Can we have a listen to your acoustic snare mics together?
Yeah, let's find us a good chunk. Probably the same bit would be fine. So this is obviously hitting the drum leveler and this compressor. So the fact that I'm gating first. It really cleans a lot of this up, and it'll be a lot more noticeable if I go and turn this gate off.
Sure.
Yeah.
What sort of levels of gain reduction have you got on the compressor?
You know, it's really hard to tell with these 4Ks, so I just crank it up until it feels like it's snapping. But usually on the LEDs, I'm looking at 3 to 6, but I have a feeling it's probably more than that at peak levels. So yeah, so we're just kind of popping now. Could probably go a little harder. But these are also, again, like we talked about before, the parallel compression hitting those, which a lot of the snap is coming from. So if I were to turn off the parallel compression and just hear what's happening on the actual snare mic channel. Now, first off, it's just all reverb. So let's see if we can get to our reverb and kill that a bit. Actually, I'll just turn them off here. So that's what we're getting there. And if we add that parallel compression back in, you hear, oh, I'm gonna have to redo my solo group here. A little more snap.
And you're taking the parallel compression feeds from the snare mic sum here?
It's from the master snare, actually, yeah. So they're all off sends, and I kind of put them down at the bottom here. And right now I'm using 3 different parallel compressors. The first 2 are hardware pieces, so those are hardware inserts. And both of those are like variations on that snappiness we were talking about earlier. And then the last one is the opposite. It's that fast attack, fast release. And it's actually the Devil Lock sound toys, which is just great for smashing drums.
Yeah.
And you could be a little more liberal with that one because it can quickly get out of control. But if we just, let's go over to this, and you should get this on your feed. I can use a listen function directly on the returns for those parallel compressors. You can hear really what's going to each one. So the complex, like, I could just listen to just this return all day because the attack characteristic of this particular compressor is just so pleasing. I wouldn't mind if just drums sounded like this like every time I heard drums because they're so smacky.
Oh yeah. The weight off that, right?
Yeah. So you can hear it's mostly snare, a little bit of kick. There's some toms in there too, there's no toms in this section. And I just send a little bit of overheads again to help glue them in.
All right, you're sending a little bit of overhead.
Just a little bit, yeah, just a bit. And then if we look at the next one, the decomp, it's a similar thing, but it has a built-in high-pass filter on the detector circuit. So I like the way it reacts more to low-end frequencies, but again, it's adding that snap. So when we listen to this one, you'll hear more kick, less snare, probably still a lot of snare, but it's more kick and toms, and I think probably no overheads, but we'll see. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the two of those together are just so smacky, and I love that sound. And that honestly is like, you can get close in the box, but I just haven't heard an in the box compressor that makes me feel the way that I feel when I solo these two. It's just something so special about that snappy attack characteristic and the saturation that happens on those the snappy part of those drum hits, that it's worth dealing with the hardware inserts and the real-time exports and all that kind of stuff to get that sound. And then if we add the Devil into the mix, it actually still, I use the slow attack setting most of the time, so it still adds a good amount of snap, but there's going to be a lot more sustain. And I typically will send some, so it's getting a lot of snare, a little bit of kick, a medium amount of toms, and sometimes some room. I'll send a little room to it, and it just helps kind of glue it all together. But
And that's
So,
devil lock.
Yeah, it's a devil lock. It still has a lot of snap on that slow attack setting, but a lot more of that ambience. You know, it's like a fader for your snare room, almost. So all these together, it's a pretty big part of the drum sound.
Yeah. So the Compex and the Decomp are both VCA compressors, are they?
I believe they are, actually, yeah. I'm not 100% sure on that, so some gear nerd out there will probably chime in and write me a nasty note. But I know they sound good. But yeah, they definitely have that characteristic, yeah.
Perfect. And then on the snare sample channel, you just got a little bit of EQ and a little bit of stereo imaging there, right?
Yeah, I think I was looking just to widen because I think there's a room sample. This is the thing that I struggle with, honestly, is sometimes I'll like to blend snare room samples or snare samples with a room sound baked into them. And I often want to be able to treat that room sample separately, but splitting it up into yet another instance of trigger, it just becomes too cumbersome. So I kind of fight with that in some regards, but this allows me to just kind of, where typically the close mics are going to be mono samples anyway, or mostly mono feeling, maybe a little overhead mixed in. The widening enables me to almost like add a little bit of width just to the room side of those samples without really affecting the mono compatibility of it too much.
And the snare samples that you've blended there within Trigger, you've got sort of like some are more, is that one of Jens's I can see there?
Yeah.
I love his naming. Fantastic. Some are dry and some are more ambient, are they?
For sure, yeah. Some of these, a lot of the samples that I choose are more finished sounds, rather than going for, natural straight out of the mic type sounds. I feel like finished sounds, or close to finished sounds, somewhat processed sounds, allow me to mix a little faster, and then they kind of give you a built-in reference. Because, okay, now I have a sound that I know like sounds good in context of a mix. So it kind of gives me like a goal of where I need to shift the actual microphone tracks towards. And it's always a little bit different. Like I would say on this project, I was pretty happy with the kick mic. So I maybe started with the kick mics, and those were kind of my true north, my lighthouse, and the samples maybe more needed to blend in with those. On the snare, it was maybe a little bit of the opposite, or maybe a little more equal footing, where the snare sample was going to be a pretty prominent part of the overall snare sound. So then the mic sources needed to kind of fall in line behind those, or at least kind of like on the same level. So it just depends on how I'm feeling about the natural sounds versus where I need to get them.
And a little bit of sculpting EQ-wise on the snare sample track.
Yeah, let's see. What are we doing here? So some cutting some of the fizz out. That probably is controlling a bit of the room too. Some of the processed snare samples can get a little bright, especially if they're going to hit further processing down the road. So that's pretty common for me, is just to pull some top end out of that. Probably not enough. I feel like my snares end up a little touch on the bright side most of the time. So conscious effort for me to not make them too abrasive in that range. And then, yeah, a little bit of just low push here for some beef, and then just kind of like smoothing out some mids. Yeah.
Some real low end there, like right below the fundamental.
It's probably honestly below where I'm doing some high passing, or some high passing over here. But sometimes, if I am really looking for fundamental, say I have, let's just like bring up in a fresh EQ as a illustrative tool here. If I'm going to high pass here and I want to add just some beef, I sometimes like the sound of something like this. And you're just like way down here below that, and you're just using like the bell end of that curve to kind of massage the end here It gives you a little bit of control, and probably could do a similar thing just by adjusting the resonance of this high pass.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm not afraid of EQ points by any means.
No, sort of like a resonant shelf, but more control.
Yeah, and it just allows me to kind of like use like larger moves over here and really kind of massage exactly where I want that resonance.
Fantastic. And a little bit of stereo widening on the sample sum.
Let me get rid of this guy here. That's on the snare. Yep. Yeah, just a bit.
Yeah.
And I feel like the S1, it's just, I think it's really just altering the mid and the side rather than using any like psychoacoustic tricks to widen the snare or to widen the source. Because those you can run into phase issues, where this one seems to be, it can definitely sound unnatural if you push it too far. Typically about 1.3 is as far as I feel you can go with this processor on just about any source. But yeah, I think in this case, it just made the room sound a little more prominent and wide. And I think some of that is because the room mics with the session are all mono. Where typically I like to have a spaced pair, like a nice wide omni spaced pair room mics to get that overall encompassing stereo wide room sound. So I think I was kind of trying to get that through some other sources.
Sure. Then can we just have a listen to the snare mic channel, then the snare sample channel, and then both of them summed?
Yep. So again, snare mics. So pretty even footing as far as levels go, but obviously playing a different role in the overall sound.
And there's some really nice reverbs, some ambience coming from the snare samples.
The samples, yeah, and the reverbs that I'm running live, which I believe, actually, no, because those had just been turned off. So if you hear it with those back on, that's the wrong track. This is the right track. And I think I had both of these on. So 2 reverbs on snare, one that is just like a room verb, a little bit shorter, again trying to just add some more glue around the whole kit, and then I'll typically have like a longer, brighter hall sound to give it that kind of the length that I like out of a snare verb.
So quite long reverbs there. You don't go for the shorter plates.
No, yeah. Even on really fast stuff, my like longer hall snare reverb will sometimes be 2.5 seconds, 3 seconds, and it's just like, it's not super prominent, but it just kind of like soaks in there underneath the mix, just adds a layer.
Sure. And what reverbs are those?
Let me get to my effects channels here. And the room one is this Sonseg Rev A that I've been digging a lot by Relab. It's a little, let's see here, we can listen on this guy. That's going to be probably pretty low on your end, but more of a room sound. It's still not super short, over a second, but definitely is trying to add that space. Versus, let's see, what am I using? I'm using a Pro R, I think, here as my other snare verb, which definitely had some room sound too. It's actually not super long.
Sounds really long though, doesn't it?
Yeah, but a little more of a tail to it, So, and it's pretty bright and has a little bit. Sounds like it has a little bit of a pre-delay in it too, to kind of give you some of that slap. Yeah.
Sure. And what other elements apart from? So there's a little bit of kick getting sent to those verbs as well, is there?
I don't think there's any kick. Let's pull up my sends. Yeah. So right now there's no verb on the kick. The toms are going to that first reverb, the drum room, and really that's about it. I do have another verb set up here that I just call a huge verb, and I will automate on and off. So actually, if we go over to the middle section, I think I have an extra big long verb that pops in.
Yeah.
And if we listen, if we just solo these, so here's the tighter section of the song without that verb. Oh, hold on. I think I have, there we go. So that's just the shells, obviously, and if we go to this section with that extra reverb.
Yeah.
Just gives some length and some epicness, for lack of a better word, to this part that is more epic.
Sure.
Yeah.
But you keep your overheads and your rooms out of the reverb
Yeah.
sends.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Moving on to your toms, is there a lot of, am I right in saying, we were chatting earlier that you didn't go for any tom samples here?
No, there's no augmentation on the toms. Yeah, I probably still have a little bit of fine tuning to probably do on this mix. So I may go in there and it's a chance I could copy some hits around, or maybe do some volume automation for individual fills when I feel like they need it. But really, most of it is taken care of by the gates, and then the toms also. If we go to the individual channels, I believe I'm only using the top mics. Yeah, I'm not using the bottoms at all.
Yeah.
And then all of the toms have a bit of their own EQ. So like, for instance, this is the tom 1. And if I can fit all this on the same screen, if I open tom 2, you can kind of see how the fundamental is going to shift down a bit. So we're at, the high passes at 94 Hertz. And it moves down to 84. And if I were to play these two toms, you could see that high pass is going to be right behind where the fundamental of that tom is. And then this kind of low mid knocky cut is going to follow that down too. And then the rest of these moves are just to kind of unify the toms. So before they hit the group, I just make moves to each tom to clear up any mud below that fundamental, and then to kind of make them all gel together. Because you can have the same tom with the same head and the same mics. Some tom will just have like a weird mid-range knock to it, and all of a sudden makes it stick out and not feel unified with the whole kit. So you can kind of take care of that on the individual channels first, and then when you get to your tom group, you can make those overall EQ changes that translate well to each drum.
And it's expansion, multi-band expansion with the gating, is it?
Yeah, same type of method, and I'm doing the same thing where I'm splitting the frequencies with a faster release up top, slower release down below. Another tool that I sometimes use that's like in conjunction to manage bleed is I'm actually having on the snare mic and the toms is a bit of this soothe here, and I have a few presets I've made that I usually cycle between that are just meant to take care of some resonance up top with fast attack and fast release, and that again, it's just like another layer to kind of smooth over some of the cymbal bleed, because it's just always such a problem with drum shells with heavy compression.
Sure. And then you compress the toms on the sum, do you, or?
I am actually, it looks like I have these compressors turned off currently. I'm using drum leveler again on each drum.
Yeah.
Usually between 40 and 60%. I'm going a little higher on these because they're more dynamic performance. And then it looks like I had this guy up, but I have it bypassed for right now. So that could have either just been something that I haven't turned back on yet before printing, or just decided that I'm getting enough with the parallel compression, because again, the drums are also hitting those parallel compressors. So the beautiful thing about using those hardware pieces as like a parallel compressor just allows me to spread that nice sweet sound across all the shells. When obviously it's not a plugin, there's only one of them. So
sure. And it's are you sending to the parallel compressors and sending to reverb from the sums or the individual channels?
From the sum, yeah. Because since so much of my processing is happening here on the sum tom group, if I were sending reverb from these channels, it's going to get probably a dull, not clean, even sounding source. So just so the reverbs are getting what is a balanced signal already, I'm going to send it from the tom group.
Sure, and
the
then
same
there's
with the parallel compression too.
yeah, bit of transformer coloration there on the
Oh, the True R,
some,
yeah.
and then the Better Maker. What's that?
It's an EQ, and honestly, I like very rarely use this one, but I popped it up on toms once, and I thought it sounded pretty cool. It's just like this, GUI is just like so unintuitive to me that I can't imagine like just like digging into this and like shaping a sound. Maybe it would be different if I had the actual hardware here, but this is one of those cases where like maybe they could have simplified this for using a mouse and a keyboard. But I believe it's supposed to be like a Pultec style EQ, and I think I'm just like literally like it's hard to even tell what I'm doing with this thing, but I'm boosting some low end,
Yeah.
and boosting some top end, just kind of like wide. I just thought it maybe had like a nice bloomy sound on toms. But again, this is not like I've barely used this guy. It's just been like, it sounds cool on toms. I think I've used it for a few sessions, but I don't know that it's going to stick around. It's just kind of like a flavor of the month for right now.
And then a bit more EQ and
then the Pro Q3 is like my go-to. I mean, you can see like, I get pretty crazy curves going on here, but I like, I guess I've just become accustomed to just really focusing on this. Like, this is what matters, and I just like, if I just need to shape something a little bit, I just add a point, and it's just so quick and smooth. And when I hear a sound in my head, I see it in Pro Q3. So it's just like an extension of my brain at this point as far as sculpting.
And a lot of your sculpting, interestingly, it's with quite wide cues.
Yeah.
Is that something or is that a general approach of yours? You don't tend to go with narrower cues?
Before the days of Soothe, I would get some pretty narrow cuts on for resonant stuff, and I still may sometimes. Like, these overheads and room mics sounded pretty good, but let's see, I might have some sharper cuts. Actually, no, not really there. On room, yeah, honestly, pretty clean. So I kind of stay pretty wide, and then I'm handling a lot of those sharper resonant things with some of these tools. So I'll use a combination typically of BX Refinement, which sort of does a soothe type thing, and then I stack it with a bit of this guy in varying degrees, and this is actually being hit pretty hard. And this is on the room, so really just pulling a lot of those resonance out of the room mics. And so it handles a lot of that where I would typically need to use a lot of static sharp cuts. These dynamic tools just do a great job of kind of like doing it for you,
Sure, and doing it dynamically as well.
And you can get it's like, that's a dangerous path to go down, is to go hunting for those frequencies and just sit there for hours, tiny little notches, because at least for me, my ears start to adjust, and I hear resonant frequencies everywhere, and I just go to town, and all of a sudden I pull out of solo mode, and I listen to the whole mix, and it's just like dull and lifeless. So I much prefer using these tools because they allow you to move through that part pretty quick. And then even if later you're like, I still hear some pokiness, you just go in there, make a couple quick tweaks, forget about it. You don't have to go down that rabbit hole of hunting for those resonant frequencies, and it kind of just really throws your objectivity off.
Sure.
And kind of puts your ears into like a troublesome spot as far as like trying to hear the whole overall mix. You're just too dialed into the details at that point.
Can we have a quick listen to your toms?
Sure. Let's find us a good tom fill. That's a pretty good spot. So I'll solo them, and then I'll play them in context with the whole kit. Pretty pretty unified sound, and a lot of that is just coming from the sculpting I do to each individual tom, you know, to get them to play nice together.
Absolutely. And then I see you've got close overheads and main overheads. Are these duplicated tracks or?
No, I just split up and this is a pretty recent change in my workflow. Like, you know, again, kind of always adjusting. So I'll take like my main overhead left, right, center tracks and process them independently of what I would consider close mics, which in this case would be the overhead and the ride. And it allows me to, it's mostly with how much low end comes through. So I'm actually cutting a lot of low end out of the main overheads here. So if we listen, let's get back to, let's see how this part is. Versus the close overheads, which is really going to be hi-hat. I guess it allows me to use EQ to control the amount of shells I'm getting in the main overheads, and then be able to be a little lighter on those close mics because they're not going to have as much shell. There's going to be a lot more, you know, signal to noise ratio is going to be more of the instruments just because they're right up on it. So, and then I don't typically, I guess part of it is me being too lazy to go in and clean up the close overhead tracks, where a lot of guys will go in there and if it's a hi-hat mic, they'll wipe everything that's not hi-hat. I kind of get around having to do that because it's just too mind-numbing for me by just splitting them up a little bit, I guess.
But your main overheads, as in the sort of like the cymbal overheads, you've sculpted quite a lot of low end out of those, have you? Yeah.
Yeah, I typically do, and I think that's maybe because I spent probably 10, 12 years recording drums in really small, untreated rooms. So it's like the DIY method of like, man, this room does not sound good, and there's way too much bounce everywhere, and the shells are just so loud on the overheads because it's such a tight room and with not a lot of control, that I just got used to really cutting a lot of that low end out, and at this point it's just kind of become part of my flow, and then I pull a lot of that low end sound back in on the rooms.
So just the EQ curve one more time on the overheads.
So this is what I'm doing to the main overheads, which is like high passing at, you know, about 475, sculpting some more mids and a little bit of lift. I don't always do this. I just felt that these were on the darker side, so I could use a little more of the sizzle. And then a similar, but just not quite as extreme. I'm sorry, that's the same one. Similar, but not quite as extreme on the close overheads. So I'm allowing a little more of that. It's still probably high passing around the same amount, but I'm allowing a little more of that mids, not boosting as much of the sizzle on these. But then they're also, again, going to this master overhead track, which has some further sculpting of those like kind of papery upper mids. And then another combo of the BX refinement and the Soothe 2 to varying degrees.
Cool. Can we have a listen to the overheads, close overheads and main overheads with and without the EQ? I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, let's go. Let's try this chunk. So all of them together with and without EQ?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We can do it this way. Kind of brightens them up, and then all of these EQs have auto gain too. So if I turn this off, obviously you get a much bigger level change because of how much we're removing here. But I quite like that feature of Pro Q3 because it allows you to at least somewhat remove the volume change element when you're trying to make decisions on tonal choices.
Louder perceived better.
Yeah, obviously, you know. So, and it doesn't do the perfect job. It adjusts definitely for high passing and low passing. It tends to overcompensate, but you know, it's just algorithm based, so it's not going to be perfect. But it still helps you, you know, if you're pulling mids and it's kind of like bringing the perceived volume up at the same time, allows you to really focus on what you're doing to the frequency spectrum rather than having to fight through that volume change.
Absolutely. And do you ever tend to compress your overheads, just either bring the snare down or bring the snare out?
Sometimes that's like a case by case. It's more if it becomes a problem. If I do feel like there's too much snare shell, I have used a similar manner as I'm using as a gate for the toms and snare. I'll use an instance of Pro MB sidechain to the snare, so you can really zero in a band of a like dynamic compressor to the snare fundamental, and then sidechain it to that snare sound, so it's only ducking when the snare is hit. That's going to be really transparent. Um, Pro and B and Fat Filter, like really the Fat Filter stuff are just such good problem solvers because of how universal they are and how just capable they are. So like if you need to just fix an issue, like the Fat Filter stuff is honestly where I'm going to look to first.
Absolutely. So you didn't compress the overheads in this?
Not in this
mix,
case.
no?
And sometimes if I feel like I just need a little more unified sizzle, I'll add, I like an 1176 on overhead sometimes. You probably use the Purple Audio MC77. This is one of my favorite plug-in 1176s. And just touch them, you know, like typically almost always when I'm using 1176, it's going to be 4-to-1. Somewhere like this, fast release, attack, somewhere around 3. And then I'm just going to pull a little bit down. If I'm trying to remove snare, maybe that attack's going to be a little bit higher. But really just like 1 to 4 or 5 dB of reduction on the meters, just to add a little bit of life to them. But on this mix, I didn't feel it was necessary.
And with the drums that we've listened to so far, we got this really incredible ambience with your snare, and the toms are sounding absolutely great. What was and obviously you got the reverbs, the two reverbs that you're using. What was your approach with the rooms with this track?
So we had 3, I believe, separate room mics. Let me find them. And it looks like I'm using a mix of all of them, going with predominantly with the Coles. And I actually don't have any individual processing, so I just kind of like found a balance I like. And then typically with rooms, I'm going to crush them somewhat. So why don't we just listen to a bit and then we can see what I've done here.
Yeah.
So a really cool sounding room already, honestly. I've started with, again, some pretty heavy-handed EQ to kind of pull the low end out, tame the high end, pull some mids out, and most of these moves I'm gonna do, even though it's before the compressor, I'm gonna make most of these moves listening to the compressed signal. First, it's going through another instance of refinement and soothe, just like the overheads, just to control some of those resonance to make the room sound a little less ugly, specifically since we're going to smash it kind of hard, you know? And then I'm always going to audition a few different compressors. This is actually the first time I've used this guy. Probably like a lot of people, of course, like video is timeless, but I just got access to all the SSL plugins because they added it to the Slate bundle. So in some ways, it's a little overwhelming to have to figure out which of these 30 new plugins I want to use, which I had maybe had like 3 or 4 of them before. But this one sounds really cool in this blitz mode, which is kind of like an all buttons in emulation. But some of the other ones I've used, like honestly, this has probably been my main room compressor for a long time. And they're actually still here on the track from when I was kind of auditioning which compressor, which is going to serve the song best. And I went with this guy because it sounded kind of fun. It sounded pretty explosive. I get a handful of others that I'll pick from, just looking for that smash sound. And I'll typically hit it pretty hard and then pull the mix back a bit. So I don't even know where the mix is. Oh, here it is. 70% is pretty average, so somewhere between 50 to 70%. But I'll dial it in like this, you know. I'll dial it in at 100%, find right where it's on that edge of getting too crunchy, too broken up, and then typically pull the mix back a bit just so it's just not too pumpy and too out of control back there.
And so with your rooms, you weren't sending to reverb or parallel compression from those?
Just a bit of parallel compression to the Paradevil, just to add a little bit into that squish. So let's see. That's the wrong button. That's the right button. Yeah, so it's down, 15 dB from Unity. So if we just listen to I'll pull up this parallel compressor and then I can turn this on and off. You see how much it's applying. Because like even that compressor is so aggressive that even 15 dB down from Unity is going to be a decent amount.
Can we just see the plugin itself there,
Sure.
Dave?
Yeah. I'll bring that up to, put that guy over there. So set pretty moderately, just because this thing can just get out of control. But and then so it's not doing much. The room mics are kind of tucked a little bit anyway, and so this is another 15 dB down from this fader level. But it just helps a little bit of glue. It's typically what I do.
Can we just have a listen to the drum sound without the rooms and without the parallel compression maybe? And then, without the rooms first of all, and then add the rooms, then do the same.
Yeah, the parallel compressor is going to make a big volume change because they're a pretty prominent part. But yeah, without the rooms... kind of fills those gaps in.
Yeah, just a bit of reverb and dimension.
Yeah, you feel it in the snare a lot, and it kind of fills out the cymbals, specifically since I do so much high passing on my overheads. I rely on the room sound a little bit to fill those in and give the whole kit a little more body, a little more roundness. And I may have even used a little more of this if I had stereo rooms, but just because I don't want to mono my drums out too much, and only having a mono room mic, the louder you turn that up, it just sort of brings things into the center, and I just like everything to be big and wide.
Sure.
So so that was a limiting factor there too.
And then we just have to listen to the drums without the two reverbs and then introduce the two reverbs?
Sure. Let's get over here. And so it's not really doing a ton.
No, but it does give it that. It just makes the snare a little more explosive.
Yeah. And then there's some on toms too. We didn't really hear too many toms here. Maybe I can pick a tom section so we can get a little bit of that too. Yeah. Again, pretty minimal. Really just like, I don't want to hear too much of that like fake sounding tom verb, that was like a little too prevalent in the 80s. So it's just to help bed them into the mix a little bit. And in this case, the overheads are pretty lively sounding and the room sounds good. So you're getting most of what you need out of those.
And lastly, on the drums, on your drum bus, are you sending your reverbs and your parallel channels to the master drum bus?
No, those just go straight to the mix bus. Yeah, because sometimes I'll use these on, like, maybe if I just need a room for a guitar layer or a vocal part, I'll just, I got a drum room, it's already ready to go, it sounds good, I'll just send it over there. So even though they're labeled, drum room, snare verb, I may use them in other parts of the mix, and then I don't want them messing up my stems if I'm trying to print a drum stem and all of a sudden I have a vocal part come through the reverb, can get a little messy. So
sure. So all your kick sample your acoustic kicks, same with the snare sample and acoustic mics, and your toms are all going to the drum bus along with your, obviously your metalwork, your rooms, but without the reverbs and without the parallels.
Yeah.
And are you...
The parallels actually do feed into the drum bus.
Oh, the parallels do,
Yeah,
okay.
the parallels do.
And have you got any processing on the drum bus?
Let's see. I have an EQ that I probably didn't use, although sometimes I will. I have just like a virtual console bus emulation. So again, just like small amounts of that crunchy saturation. And then I do quite like this guy, which is, I guess it's a multi-band saturation plugin.
Okay.
It's again, it's a little bit of one of those like more modern voodoo style plugins where it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what it's doing, but I like the way it kind of shapes everything. It has some kind of smart frequency management features in there that smooth some things out, but it still gives you a little bit of control in a few different modes for the saturation and coloration that's adding. But yeah, we can play a little bit before and after if you want.
That'd be great.
Yep. Let me get out of this tom fill. Go to, give us a couple of measures here.
Bringing out the ambience, isn't it? I can hear it.
Yeah, in this case, it's pretty subtle, but I like what it does at the top end, and you can really push some like sub-fundamental. Like here, I'm gonna save these settings real fast, and then I can play with these, and you can see what's possible. I'm just using it in a pretty subdued case here, but if you you can really do a lot if you dig into it more. It's just, I guess it's sort of like an exciter, but a more controlled one. It gets used on drum bus fairly often, bass fairly often. Yeah, I have it on bass. And then very rarely, if I'm just like feeling like the entire mix just needs a little more juice, I'll toss it on mix bus and use it kind of in a subtle manner. But it's got some saturation built in that's off in this particular case. It's kind of nice. It's just kind of a cool little color box.
Sure.
Yeah.
And am I right in saying with your drums, no use of limiters or clippers?
I will occasionally clip snare if I'm going really crazy with, say, transient designing, or I'm really hitting the parallel compressors so much where I'm just getting massive snare spikes. Then I will sometimes use some type of limiter or clipper either on the drum bus or on the snare bus. Lately, I've been using this guy, which is just super easy, and it has a clipping mode and a limit mode, or this hybrid mode, which is probably more useful on the mix bus. But the clipping's really nice. It's kind of like a one knob threshold, and you can either have it auto gain or not. You know, so if you're looking just to control it. And the visuals are real handy. Let's see what channel. I did put it on drums. So I like the visual feedback it gives you of exactly what you're removing, you know. So yeah, this one, but again, that's like a rare case scenario for me, honestly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Moving on to bass, if that's okay.
Yep.
Firstly, what low-end management techniques did you use on this mix, and do you tend to use when dialing in the lows of the bass sound?
So it depends. If I'm using neural DSP parallax, which is probably 70% of the time for me, then that pretty much is most of my low-end management. It just kind of takes care of what I need to. But it is like, it gives you that grindy sound, and that's like mostly what it does. It's kind of hard to get it to pull back to be really clean. So if I don't want any of the grind, then I may do more stuff like frequency splitting and use an L1 or something like that to really squash the low end. But in this case, let's actually just go to my bass tracks here. So we did, let's see, we are using, actually, I think just one of the printed amps, which is the Classic, which I'm assuming was an SVT Classic.
Was indeed.
And then I'm using the DI through Parallax and through the BOD overdrive emulation. But before it hits these, I actually did process the DI through a distressor and a Pultec, just to kind of clean up some peaks and bring up the RMS volume of the bass to make it hit those gain stages a little cleaner, and to give it a little more bite and a little more bloom and some tube coloration. So we can actually, it's again probably pretty subtle, but I have the DI before processing and the DI after if you want to hear the two.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's put these at Unity, and I'll just use the listen function. So here's the DI straight from the session.
Yeah.
So it kind of just evens out the sustain, brings that sustain up, still leaves a kind of snappy attack, and then you can kind of hear a little extra top end from then. Actually, you know what? I have this software I use to track hardware settings, so we can look at exactly how I had these set. And there we go, bass DI processing. Man, this is really huge in this resolution, so let's trim that down a bit. Actually can't, there we go. But yeah, so 6:1, which is where I lean on bass a little bit. I will use the high pass in the detector, so it lets some of that low end through. I usually like the distortion 2 on distressors for most sources, honestly. And then I think I was probably getting maybe up to 6 or 8 dB of reduction on the peaks, and then probably going down to 0 on some of the sustains. So it was really just pulling the peaks down and allowing the sustain to come up. And then a little bit of that Pultec trick, you know, where you boost and attenuate the same, but I'm still leaning a little harder on the boost. And then a nice wide boost at 8K. And I usually just shave a little bit of the tippy top off, because I find that smooths out some sources too. But
Sure.
Pretty standard. I mean, you can the nice thing with Pultecs, there's no wrong settings. You know, you can just turn everything up and it still sounds good. They're just so wide and smooth that you can't really get yourself into trouble with them.
And even just running the signal through a Pultec without it doing anything, just
sounds good.
It sounds better. And just again, with and without the processing on the bass DI.
Sure. Yeah. So without.
Cool. And were you using the DI? You were using the DI processed within the bass sound itself, were you?
Yeah, but actually no. So the DI isn't any part of this. Both of these were down, but that processed DI is feeding the parallax and the bass driver emulation. So it's helping kind of make the gain staging that both of those plugins add a little smoother. You know, it makes the sustain feel a little more gritty, a little more solid. So it's, and when I actually dialed in the compression settings and the EQ settings, I was auditioning through a little bit of the parallax. So I'm hearing how it's feeding into it. And I've got some input boosted again here just to kind of dial in the gain I like.
Okay, we just have a listen to the parallax channel, because that's
Absolutely
not too driven here. There's not too much drive on this.
No, but I'm pushing more than you might think with the input.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's hitting all of it. But yeah, I typically will leave the actual drives down pretty low, but it'll still sound pretty driven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then using a bit of the EQ, and then honestly, I feel like one of the secrets of Parallax, and if you're using their cab, is this 906. I actually ended up buying a 906 to use on bass cabs because something is magical about their emulation of a 906. It sounds so far and above better than all of the other mics to me that it's pretty much all I ever use. and it's just the 906 straight in the center with no distance, and it just like shapes the sound just right to sit in the mix for me.
Jam it in the dust cap.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that's definitely like I liked Parallax a lot when I first got it, but when I was like all of a sudden the 906 thing clicked for me, I was like, oh, this is all I'm ever using because it just shapes it just right.
Fantastic. And you've just hit the VTM
After, yeah.
after the
So Parallax is essentially acting as my amp, you know. So and then a little tape and a little mix bus after, so it's applying to like, you know, the amped sound.
And then if we have listened to the Sans Amp
Mhm.
PSA emulation. Oh, it's bass driver, isn't
Bass
it?
driver, yeah.
And obviously that's the process DI going through that.
Yeah, the process for both. And that I really like the attacking nature of it. Kind of gives you some of that classic SVT sound. I think that's what the bass drivers were made to sort of emulate, an SVT sound. And then I find it's one of the best ways to get a solid low mid, which is a really tricky part to have come out and not sound muddy in a bass guitar. And the Sans amp, those bass drivers just like manage that side of the signal in a really natural way and allows it to sit in the mix and fill that void. You don't want like zero low mid in your bass tone, but it's just so easy for that to sound woofy and kind of like farty and messy. I lean pretty heavily either on this emulation or I have, you know, the actual pedal that in my opinion is a special sounding one because I've compared it to a bunch of others and it's just got a little bit of something extra that some of the newer ones don't. So
sure. And you just use a little bit of EQ just to shape it before going into the
in this case, yeah, I think again just controlling that low mid, and it looks like maybe I was controlling the notch, the attack and that notchiness at some point, but it's disabled, so didn't feel like I had the need to.
And then from there, you're just using the Ampeg Classic lesson, okay? And just so on these tracks, you're not EQ, you're not compressing them individually. You're just and then just a bit of EQ on the Ampeg Classic, probably just to take out some.
Let's see what I did here.
Yeah.
So there you go. There's some sharper cuts for you. This one did have a little bit of like pokey resonance on the pick attack. So if I get out of here and that is soloed, we can hear this before and after EQ.
Yeah. Just cleaning it
Just
up.
cleans it up, gets rid of some of those harsh like pick attacks, you know, that kind of like make your ears tickle a little bit.
And then are you compressing pretty heavy on the bass bus?
Probably not. Actually, I mean, he has a little bit of the sugar, which adds a bit of compression, but really most of these sources combined with the compression that I do the DI beforehand, I don't typically add a ton of compression to the bass at any stage. So altogether. Some soothe as well, just to kind of help almost any distorted source. I may be blending in a little bit of this, just helps to kind of smooth it out, get rid of some of those harsh frequencies, make things able to be a little bigger, but not hitting it too hard. And then a little bit of this sugar for the excitement, boosting some saturation that low end to kind of like get that nice and full sounding. And let's see what we're doing EQ wise in here. Yeah, really not a ton. The bass sources are really good on this. Like the playing is solid. The tone, the DI tone sounds great. Pretty much all of the amp choices that you provided sound good. I just know I can get the low end I need out of Parallax, and the combination of that with the bass driver just like gets my fundamental in place.
Sure.
And then add a little bit of the color from that SVT Classic.
And did you use any stereo widening techniques with the bass? Any?
No, I typically probably don't on bass. I'm always just worried about phase stuff, you know. Even some of the phase safe ones like the S1, like there's nothing stereo in the source. So I kind of just want it right down the middle, keeping things nice and nice and tight.
Fantastic. Moving on to the guitars, we were chatting earlier that you made the decision to reamp the guitars,
I
and
did, yeah.
we were chatting about the
6534.
65 with the EL34s,
Yeah.
and with a Messer on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And you just felt that with the guitars that I sent you, just wanted a little bit more drive and saturation.
A little more drive. Yeah, it's really like the boost. I have definitely gone down the rabbit hole with boost pedals in front of a tube amp. That really can control so much about how the performance feels.
Yeah.
So it's rare that I'm going to hit a tube amp without a boost in front, and they all have the different colors. So I'll pick 4 or 5 and put them all in a chain, and I sit there and I'm going back and forth and tweaking. And then I usually find one that just suits the performance right.
Yeah.
There's so many different varieties. There's obviously the Tube Screamer lineage.
Yep.
There's the TC Electronics lineage, which now like the popular ones would be like the Dirty Tree, and there's plenty of those styles. And they all kind of have, I know what they do, so in this case I felt like a more traditional Tube Screamer based boost would be appropriate, and I think I ended up going with, and this, I remember now, on this mix, I actually used a different boost for each amp, which is a rarity for me.
Okay.
Typically, you'll find one that I feel like suits the guitar tone, the playing style the best, and then it just kind of goes to whatever amps I'm using. But on the 6534, I used a Savage Drive, which is a really great underappreciated boost pedal. And then on the Mesa, I used one that I just got, a really cool German company called Lichtalarm. I think it's Lichtalarm Audio.
Yeah.
Lichtalarm for sure. And it's called the King in Yellow. It's a beautiful pedal. And it's a bass off a Tube Screamer, but has some blending functions and a 4-band EQ and some cool stuff. And allow me to dial it in. So if you want to just hear the tones, the amp tones that were with the project, and then kind of where I ended up dialing in, we can certainly do that.
That'd be fascinating. With your general approach with pedals, there's the old sort of Tube Screamer trick of dialing it in with no additional gain or level or tone, and it just sort of like the high pass filtering, just tightening up the low end a little bit. Is it that you go for a bit of more drive? Or?
That's part of it. If I use any drive on a Tube Screamer style, it's going to be just a touch. And I think actually on these, I didn't use any. Although the Savage Drive, although it's like kind of in the Tube Screamer lineage, it's a different style pedal. So I am using some of the drive because it's like kind of a combined level and drive. I try to drive down all the way. There's no output.
Yeah.
So it's adding a bit of that crunch, but most of it is for the boost, the actual like signal boost into the amp.
Yeah.
And a little bit of the Tube Screamer, obviously, with cleaning up that low end, making the palm mutes come out in a little bit more aggressive manner.
Sure.
So let's find a riff. And we have the band amps here. And you sent a few different amps with a great list of what all of them were. I think the Rig 1 was a PV, wasn't it?
I think it was the Mark 1, if I remember rightly. I'd have to have a look. Yeah, I think it was a Mark 1 5150 on the red channel.
Okay, so there you go. This is a good one. This bouncy riff. And then on my 6534 tracks, it's really just saturating more on those palm mutes. And that's the Mesa tracks there, which ended up being a little bright, but they're probably pulled back in the mix.
Sure.
I mean, that's the main difference I was looking for. It's just a little more saturation. You know?
And it was, if I remember rightly, a 6534 hard left, hard right, and then you were just bringing up the Mesa.
The Mesa behind it, yeah. Also hard left and hard right. But the different performances, because we have quad-tracked rhythms here. If we close these and look at the DIs. So yeah, I relabeled these 1A1 or 1A 2A. So obviously one has a harmony, like one is the roots and the twos have the harmonies, and then the A's and B's are the doubles of those individual tracks. So the PV is getting both performances, the root and the harmony track, and the Mesa is getting that as well. And then 2 to the PV, 2 to the Mesa, and then that allows me to blend the amps without ruining the balance of the 2 performances.
So with this reamping process you went through, you were using a real cab and a real mic.
Yep.
Were you using just the one mic or double micing? Or?
Just the one mic. It's a Unidyne 57, so I mean, 57 on a guitar cab is just a match made in heavy metal heaven. It's hard to get away from that sound. So much so that, you know, now guys are out there searching for all these vintage 57s and the Unidyne varieties, trying to just get a different flavor on that same type of sound because it just sounds so good. I'll occasionally blend a little more. Usually if I have a band in here that's kind of outside of my normal mold, or we're maybe using their cabs, or, you know, a different cab from the Mesa Oversized, which I'm just using probably 90% of the time, I'll throw some other mics up there, and it allows me to kind of like, one gives me a little safety blanket in case the 57 is too thin or too small, or I just feel I need to get something a little more unique. But it's just hard to get away from that sound. It just sounds right.
And vintage 30s in there?
Yeah, V30s.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and particularly the Mesa V30s, which are their own particular flavor, you know. And I know there's a lot of people like Nolly, who we were talking about earlier, have just gone down the rabbit hole with tracing down the serial numbers and the years and all the different varieties. I just know that I have a Mesa cab that I really like the sound of. So. And
you were pretty close to the dust cap, were you, or dead?
Yeah, usually right on that edge. You know, yeah. I've got a robot back there too. What are they? Dynamount, yeah, which is the little microphone robot. You know, yeah. So I've got it kind of zeroed in on the center of the cap, and then I know, like, you know, what number to type in to get me to the edge, and then there's a little some different varieties right there, but it's all just right around the edge of that dust cap.
And you keep it on axis? Or
yeah, usually on axis, yeah.
Fantastic. And did you print any EQ on the way in?
No, not on this. Sometimes I will, just real slight. I've got some old Neve channels pulled out of a desk here. I just got these SSL ones, and every once in a while, maybe even just go through them without any moves, or just a little bit of that transformer. But there's so many variables on a guitar tone, and there's enough to think about with dialing in the amp and making sure your levels coming out of your reamp box are hitting the amp properly, messing with your boost pedals, blending multiple amps. It's like, there's enough to worry about there, you know.
Were you driving the amps pretty hard, or you were more moderate levels?
I would say probably pretty hard. I'm looking for some of that speaker breakup. Yeah. For me, kind of how I judge that is I'm almost always using the same preamp for guitars as this Cranesong Spider, and I know if I set it with the level all the way up and the input gain at 24 decibels, that I need to be right around 9 to 7 dB under Unity, and that's kind of like what I aim for. And so I've kind of developed that workflow. It's like, okay, this is right where this cab sounds good, and it's breaking up just right.
Sure, beautiful. And then do you tend to EQ on the individual channels on guitar, or on the sum, or on both?
On both. So it really depends on, in this case, since I'm mixing 2 different amps, I'm bringing in both the 6534 tracks on a subgroup, and the Mesa tracks on their own subgroup, and then they both sum to one guitar bus. So, sure. And honestly, I probably started without any of these, and just kind of finding a balance of the two of them together, and then putting a little EQ on the kind of master guitar group, and then would go back and decide, like, okay, well, the Mesa's a little bit too bright. I'm pretty sure that's what I did here. Yeah, so I pulled out some of this kind of ratchety top end out of the Mesa. But you can see there's no like high or low pass on these, because that's all happening on the master guitar. So a lot of the big moves on the final group, and then just some minor adjustments to the individual amps to get them to play well together.
Can we just have a listen to the individual amps, the 6534s and then the Mesas?
Certainly. So you can hear the Mesa, even with a pretty aggressive boost, still has that slower, softer saturation,
Yeah.
which I really love that sound, honestly. And then the PV is a little sharper, a little more mid forward, a little more aggressive, and kind of detailed, I suppose.
Can we listen to the 6534s again?
Certainly.
Just, yeah. Sounding great, aren't they? What's the EQ curve on the individual ones? One more time. You just sort of like just a little bit of low mids.
Yeah,
And...
cleaning up some boominess, you know, and then just really taking care of some of the aggressive stuff. Like, again, doing this for a long time, I know the spots that I hit right away. You're gonna clean up some of that low mid bloom,
Yeah.
and then pull down some of the notchier mids in a few different spots, like the lower stuff around 1K, and then for sure around anywhere of 2 to 4K is going to be where that really aggressive kind of ear piercing stuff comes in, and you gotta be delicate in some sense, because that's also where a lot of the tone lives. But almost every amp is going to come in a little hot at those.
But what I find really interesting, and it's that, you know, obviously it gets the right results, is I'm not seeing any sort of like surgical EQ moves for the reason we discussed earlier. It's all broad EQ, broad general shaping moves rather than the surgical kind of like.
And it's because of this combo that I love so much. That's just taking care of so much of that. So like it's a good place to kind of A/B this. So this audio gritter thing is just a tool I use to kind of chain effects together. And it also has some benefits on like the CPU usage processing side. But mostly I use it just to kind of like, okay, I'm going to often use these two in combination. So this allows me just to have them make up one insert spot. But if we play the same chunk and I turn that on and off, you'll hear why I don't really need to do most of that surgical stuff. Truthfully, a lot of mixes it's way worse than that. It's still being pretty subtle here, but it just clears up some of those ratty upper mids without me really having to dive in and do that.
And the EQ on the Sun, just one more time, Dave. And again, that's sort of like, you know, your low pass and your high pass filters just to take out the rumble and the noise, but no additive EQ in the lows or the highs on the Sun.
No, just this kind of thing we talked about earlier, where I like to kind of massage the end of my, so I'm low passing pretty low down here, just above 7K.
Yeah.
But then if you feel like it's getting a little dull, you can just put a point up here, and it just helps bring in a little bit of sparkle in kind of a natural way.
And no dynamic EQ moves or multiband compression for the chugs?
I sometimes will do that. I just didn't feel like it was necessary. Really, the boost took care of most of it, you know, cleaning up the low end. But yeah, sometimes I'll end up with one of these guys down here, or you know, the infamous C4 anti-sneak trick.
Yep.
I haven't used probably C4 for that purpose, and I don't think I've used C4 in about 10 years. But I'll most often just use a dynamic band or Pro Q3, or pull up a Pro MB.
Yeah, sure.
And just handle it that way, you know. So. And
you're just using the, I think, was it the 4K on the virtual mix? Right.
Yeah, all of these are, I pretty much I usually just stick with the 4K emulation. I used to kind of play around with them more, but these days it just gets what I need. These are pretty subtle, honestly. Like, you'd hear the difference if I turn them all on or all off. Some of that's volume. They do add a little bit of volume, so you got to listen through that.
Got a bit of drive as well, though.
Yeah. I do push a drive just because I like the saturation. And like I said, with my tendencies to go through that clean sound, I kind of like find ways to stack in the saturation at multiple points in subtle manners at multiple points, just to like fill in those gaps.
Sure. And then with the guitars, you've pretty much got them all grouped, and you've not got any reverbs, no delays. You're keeping them just absolutely dry.
Yeah, for the rhythms, yeah. You know, if this track doesn't really have any other guitar layers,
Yep.
In the case that I'm going to have leads or obviously solos, they're also going to be grouped and probably go to the guitar bus. But in that case, I would have a little more extensive routing where I would have the two individual amps going to a rhythm guitar group, and then that rhythm guitar group feeding to the master guitar group. That way I can treat the rhythm guitars, and then I would have leads going to a separate lead group, just like staging that.
Sure.
It allows me just to kind of like apply processing in a more efficient manner.
Do you have any general principles that you go with when trying to negotiate this sort of sonic puzzle between the bass and the guitars? Can we have a listen to the bass and guitars together?
Certainly, yeah. Should be fine. Bass and guitars. It's a good run. Yeah, I'm assuming you're kind of alluding to like EQ moves that I would do every time to get them to fit together.
Yeah, like mirrored EQ moves where if there's the low mids on the bass getting attenuated, it gives you a little bit of space for a bump at 300, 400 on the bass that you'd put in, or navigating space between them, or do you just kind of like use your ears?
I usually just feel it out between guitars and bass. A lot of that comes down to, so when I'm dialing in an amp, I'm going to probably have at least, so I'm going to do drums and I'm going to get my drums sounding pretty good before I reamp, and then get my bass at least set up pretty close to where I want it. And then I'm going to have those like at a spot where they're getting close to having the vibe they're going to eventually have while I'm dialing in my guitar tone.
Yeah.
So that's the beautiful thing about reamping rather than being stuck with, the tone that you track with, is you have the ability to do that. You can start crafting your mix. And then guitars are so important. It's just like such an important part of a metal mix that you can get a head start on things and then dial in that amp just to fit to right with the bass.
Sure.
And a lot of that comes down to like this track was produced well in the fact that the guitars, the performances and the tones already sort of fit well together. So like a lot of that just starts like early in the process, which sometimes if I'm just in the role as a mixer, I don't have control over. Yeah. Sometimes you're trying to fix problems later, that in that case, maybe I'm EQing the DIs of the bass and the guitars to try and create some of that balance there. But in this case, that wasn't super necessary.
Do you ever compress the guitars or have any tricks for bringing any bit, more clarity or pick bite?
Not really. I mean, I get pretty heavy-handed on my mix bus, which we'll get to in a little bit. So that processing is affecting obviously everything underneath it. But at least for typically the stuff that I work on that can be more technical in nature, it's kind of hard to get away with like a lot of compression on guitars. It's just they're too all over the place, and it's not that kind of situation where you can really gain a lot of punch on like a big open chord. It's not really that kind of music in most of the cases,
So the buses that we've looked at, we've obviously got everything apart from the reverbs going to your drum bus, and then we've got the bass bus and then the master guitars bus. They're all going straight to the master bus, are they, or an instrumental bus?
No, straight to the master bus.
Straight to the master bus. Fantastic. Yeah. And then, on this idea about like intelligent EQ techniques, do you have any, going back to the bass and the kick and just the relationship between these different elements we've looked at so far, do you ever kind of like try and work out this relationship between your bass and kick and work out which is the lower in the frequency spectrum or anything like that?
I never really think about, like a lot of people say, kick below or above bass or bass above or below kick. I never really think about it like that. I kind of let the sources guide me. What I will do occasionally, I even have it loaded up here, but I'm not utilizing it, is use a bit of this guy, which is just kind of like a built-in ducker. Oh, it looks like I have an update. so you can sidechain the kick drum to your bass track, and then just do some like kind of smart ducking, and then this particular plugin kind of takes care of the frequency spectrum for you, you know. So it just really looks at those clashing frequencies and ducks those on bass. But again, for material that's this speed and up, it's kind of gets hard to get away with that, because double bass pops in and it's like, okay, well then you're just constantly ducking all the low end out of your bass, you know.
Sure.
So at that point, and again with most tools like this, I'd rather use them as like a last result or later in the process, and I'm going to try and take care of most of that interaction with my tone sculpting before I lean too heavily on a tool like this.
Sure.
Just because I feel like it's more universal, and that's like kind of the smarter way to mix. Like
Yeah.
fix a frequency puzzle first, and then if you just need a little extra push on like a slower slammy beat, then you know, certainly dig into something like this guy.
And from what I've seen, would I be right in saying that you've not used any side chains on this mix?
I don't believe I have. That would have been probably the only spot. I'm trying to, you know, I can look at my sends and see. Yeah, I don't think I have any side chaining going on right now.
Is that something you occasionally do for some projects? But
The bass kick thing we just discussed, side chaining there. Earlier we discussed like if I need to pull more snare out of the overheads or the rooms, you can do some side chaining there. That's probably about it. Occasionally, if I have heavy electronic elements and I need to control some low end there, I can either have the electronics duck the kick as well if they're burying the kick. It's mostly low end stuff, you know, is where I find the most need for that, and it's usually frequency ducking, that type of stuff.
yeah. Did you use a lot of automation on this mix, or fairly minimal?
Fairly minimal. And again, I try to handle as much as I can without automation. So automation's all going to be for the fun stuff like delay throws, reverbs on snare parts, and it's mostly just like the flow of the song. And I typically will wait as long as possible to start digging into automation, because it gets too messy if you dig into that world too early. And then I'll typically, for volume automation, I'll try and do most of it with clip gain rather than automation, just because it's cleaner.
Yeah.
For vocals, I can go down and grab a section. If I want this part louder, I can easily grab them, use my control surface here, and just clip gain it up and down, go through a whole song, as long as I have printed dynamics on these tracks, so I don't have to worry about clip gaining into like a compressor or something,
Yeah.
which I'm always going to want to do, have printed dynamics on vocals. It allows me to just level out harmonies and layers throughout a whole song with clip gain. And then it's all kind of in front of me visually. There's no hidden automation anywhere that's clouding things up. And if I feel the need later to like make a fader move, I'm not fighting automation that's written, you know.
Sure. On the subject of vocals,
Mm-hmm.
the vocals of Ralph's, they had printed processing on them, as we were chatting about earlier. Did you use any printed processing, or you left that out on the vocals?
Yeah, so I printed some 1176 and then again into the V comp, and I just went a little light on them since they were already compressed. But I like the character I get out of that combination, and some of the tone shaping. The 1176 in particular gives me some of that edge. I have a few of the A varieties, which are the dirtiest and the color ridden, that get used on vocals a lot. So I like the edge it gave Ralph's voice. On some vocalists, I'll flop that out for a distressor.
Yeah.
If I feel like I need something a little more neutral. But yeah, that combo kind of like I feel like it like pre-mixes the vocals for me in a way.
Yeah.
And it's worth it, even if I'm not using a ton of compression. It's worth just sending them through to get a bit of that color.
And you much prefer the outboard gear than any plugins?
Yeah, I mean, like you can get close, and I certainly have done mixes with plugins, and they sound fine. But I got the stuff here. It doesn't take that long to just dial them in. It's a little more intuitive to find that sound, you know. I'm moving real knobs rather than virtual ones, and then it's printed and it's done. and then I don't have to think about it anymore, you know. So.
Yep. And you just did that on the lead vocal or on the BVs as well?
Yeah, I just ran everything through. Yeah, and I can I'll typically do a little pre-leveling using clip gain, so I can make sure that the compressors are getting a pretty unified gain across all the parts, and then I cue them all up and start an offline process, and you know, go grab a cup of coffee.
Yeah. Can we have a listen to the vocals without any spatial processing for the moment?
Sure, yeah. Let's see here. So let's pick this chunk.
Dude, I was saved by a break of angels in solitude.
Yeah. And then with the effects on?
Yeah. And there's not much, a bit of reverb, and I think I have this quarter note delay on that's a static process.
In solitude, I was saved by a break of angels in solitude.
Cool. So you've got Ralph on his own bus there,
Yeah.
or is that the same bus as all the BVs are going, or that's...
Yeah, right now everything is going to that bus, and I really on this track I haven't felt the need to mix those darker. Like sometimes you might leave the lead vocals a little brighter and then kind of tone down the background vocals, but he's kind of just like a balls to the wall vocalist, for lack of a better word. So I just kind of wanted everything up front. What I have done is brought in a few tracks that I call, I have them labeled here, there's ADT 60s and 100s, and it's a combo that I utilize a lot of this. I've used a lot of different processors in the past. Lately I'm on this Waves ADT, which is, I think stands for Automatic Double Tracker.
Yep.
So it takes your mono source, pans it out left and right. The 60 stands for 60% left and right. The 100 stands for 100% left and right. Adds a little bit of static time delay between the two. And then these actually add some modulation to that time delay too, to keep it from feeling too phasey.
Yeah.
And it allows me to get a nice wide source without having to have doubles of everything. So I've kind of just like picked parts that are doubles or harmonies and put them on these 60s and 100s. So if you listen to, so let's see here, let's find a spot that has both. So here's like the mono track. And the stereo one. And it just allows me to get a wider sound stage without having to have doubles of everything, because it gets a little tricky if you're putting harmonies over here and harmonies over here, then things start to not gel together as they're intended when they're tracked. So, you know, when you layer all that together, like the part we just listened to, it feels like you have this nice wide sound stage with panned tracks and whatnot. But really, it's just the automatic double tracker adding that width.
I was saved by a break of angels.
So you're using it as an insert or parallel the ADT 60?
It's on an insert on only some of the tracks. So it's not on every track, so then you're picking and choosing. And I'll be, you know, when I'm producing vocals, I'll be pretty deliberate, and I know where I'm going to want to emphasize with these ADT tracks. And you can be really creative, like emphasizing even just certain words of a line, and they just pop out to the sides and add a lot of dynamics. Singer like Ralph, he has plenty of his own built-in dynamics, but if you're working with death metal band and it's all growls, it's just not a dynamic instrument. No. It's kind of all full on. So if you want to build some excitement, you kind of can do that with layering. It's one of the tools to make it not just feel like, okay, a slog of listening to some guy growl for a whole track.
Yeah.
You can build some dynamics, not only front and back or up and down with volume, but in and out, with those width.
Sure. There's a bit of soothe on here, will be with
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah, again, some soothe. It's the same kind of my combo here. It's like I'm not using the refinement here, so just a bit of soothe down pretty low to control, especially with some of the real piercing high stuff that Ralph does. It can get where you got some of those resonant frequencies, and that mic is just begging for mercy under the pure power of of a heavy metal singer like Ralph. Helps it out. A little EQ.
And the EQ move you've got there?
This is.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. So again, I feel like it was a pretty bright mic, and with his bright vocals, I feel like I needed to tame a lot of this stuff with my mix. So we're pulling some high end down. That's at 14K, so there's not much up there. This maybe looks drastic, but 14K is just a little bit of some air sounds and whatnot. And then containing some of this. And I probably printed some high pass when I sent them through the compressors as well. I might tackle that at that time.
Sure.
And this is just like a color EQ I use on vocals. I saw a buddy of mine, George Lever, use this plugin on vocals, and it's just got kind of a cool color to it. It sort of looks like a Pultec, but it's not really very Pultec-y. And it's subtle, but it adds like a cool kind of mid-range quality. And then I am cutting some low end and adding a bit of 4K.
Okay.
And then I use a Pro MB that just can add a little excitement. Again, so this is like dynamically controlling some low mids with the amount of layering there is on this song. That can be helpful. So it's mostly controlling in these sections, and then it's actually expanding on the top end to add a little pop to the syllables. So it's kind of just like a vocal exciter. And I've been using a variation of this on my vocal bus for a few years now, and it just kind of, again, adds a little more excitement. Handles some low mid and some mid range stuff for me in a smart way, and it just adds a little bit of spice on the start and stop.
And that's upwards expansion.
This is here, yeah. So this is actually popping up at the beginning of syllables to add a little bit of that tick back,
Okay.
Yeah.
A little bit of attack.
Yeah, especially after maybe I've done some de-essing, it'll kind of like bring some excitement back to the mix.
How much de-essing is there on this one?
You know what? I probably printed some, but I think it was pretty minimal. So I don't have any running on the actual tracks right now.
Sure.
The only thing that's on the tracks is, again, the virtual tape and mix console, and then the tracks with the ADT. So, the de-essing is just going to be pretty minimal. I try not to go overboard.
No.
You don't want to give anyone a lisp for one. And I've discovered that I'm fine with some S's. It's like it's part of the performance, and if you go too hard on that, it can just kind of make things sound dull and less exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the brass elements of this track and the string sections, how did you approach those as to how they fit in, particularly in the middle section where they're pretty prominent?
Yeah. So often when I have sections like this, let's kind of zero into these. I'll print some EQ moves and some leveling on the tracks, and then I'll do some kind of overall stuff on the main group. So if I go to my production group here, I got my slate bus, some really kind of like clean wide moves again, as you've noticed I'm a fan of, and then I do have one dynamic low shelve. I think we touched on earlier. It just helps keep anything in the production from overwhelming the bottom end because they're so dynamic.
Sure.
And then just a little bit of clearing out the top end, so like the brittle nature of some of those strings don't just poke over the distorted elements. And then a little bit of a cheat code is this plugin here, which kind of does some EQ balancing, and I use this in subtle ways on the mix bus typically, and then I often will use it on a track like this. It's just kind of like getting everything thrown at it, and it kind of just like it's like having a tiny little assistant on the track there mixing as it goes, you know? And then, so I'll put this on to start with, dial it into something around 30-30, you know, something kind of where it's not doing too much.
Yeah.
And then with this plugin in particular, I like to pull this like, okay, don't mess with anything above about 12K thing, because it really does like to boost the very tippy top a little more than I would. And then I also bring down the brighten control. This is kind of how I have this plugin load up as default. But other than that, it's a really cool plugin and does some magic stuff, and just kind of controlling the balance of something like this, where it's just like every source under the moon is kind of going to this group in a balanced way. And then I've done a little bit of volume stuff and some kind of balancing there directly on the tracks. That's printed on. But yeah, we can listen.
Perfect.
So just trying to tuck them in where they're not overwhelming the mix, you know, but you definitely want them to be noticed, and they add a lot to this part in particular. And then I do typically add some reverb. I like I kind of reuse that huge verb. This is the same verb that I'm sending the kick and snare to for this particular section. So again, it houses them, and then it kind of gives all of the individual stems like a little bit of cohesion and width to it, which is what I really like. Sometimes I'll use a little S1 on these tracks too, and that helps further separate it from the drums and bass, and kind of gives you a little more push on those elements. So it probably would sound great here. I just don't even know if I tried it. Yeah, that's kind of like one of those things where you need to constantly like check. It depends on how prominent it is in the mix. Like it's prominent in this section of the song, but overall it's not a huge part of the song. At least I didn't think it was.
No.
So depending on where it lands and like the hierarchy of the arrangement is, one, when I start bringing it into the mix, and two, how much focus I put on it, you know. So.
Sure. And then last but not least, onto your stereo
The mix
master,
bus,
your
yeah,
two bus. So everything's going to this, as in you've not got separate buses for the instruments and the vocals. We just got the vocals and all the instruments going straight to the...
Yeah, they'll like, you know, like just the subgrouping, as in like the kick mic and sample will go to the kick, and that will go to the drum bus. So everything's final destination is just a stereo out the mix bus.
Cool.
So this is one of those things that's kind of like an ever evolving part of my mix chain, and it tends to stay consistent. It's kind of like a sourdough culture where I just like add more to it, and I find something I like. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I guess if there's one part of my workflow that can be sort of templated, I'm going to end up with a lot of the similar type of processes on the mix bus, but it's a constantly evolving process. So we're going to hit, again, one more instance of the bus version of the virtual slate stuff and a true iron. So just starting off with a little more coloration.
Yep.
And then I'm actually not doing anything. I always have this loaded up.
Yep.
Sometimes I'll use it at the very end to control some high end, or like, oh man, the 4K is a little too much, or these are moves that I might see down here, you know, like this kind of stuff, just once everything's in there. But I didn't feel the need to here, so we'll wipe that. I can probably just turn this off. And then this is actually a hardware insert that goes out to my mix bus compressor, which we can conveniently just show you with this, because my current mix bus compressor is this really cool Wes Audio unit that has plug-in control. So digital recall, obviously, so it allows me to kind of play around with different settings, and this thing has some cool stuff like an iron mode, none of which I'm using here, but anyway, recalls, you know. So
Perfect.
before, when I would use like my old SSL style traditional VCA mix bus, it stayed locked in all the time. And I will say I've only had this guy for maybe a few months now, and it's not changing a ton between projects. I'm still generally going with the settings I like: 30 millisecond attack, usually the 0.1 second release or auto. I go back and forth between those depending on the style, and then 3 to 4 dB of reduction.
Sure. And this is VCA compressor?
It is, yeah. It's just essentially an SSL style, like quad VCA compressor. Just I think every hardware company in the world has a version of this mixed bus compressor because it's just so useful, especially for this kind of music.
Sure. And the attack setting there's these different schools of thought with the master bus compressor where someone like Nolly goes very fast attack, fast release to really contain the kick and the snare in the production and sort of like really duck those elements when they're hitting. And then the longer attack times, the 10 milliseconds, the 30 milliseconds. Do you change it per project, or do you tend to allow it to go for more of the punch?
I think I've probably been on 30 milliseconds for the last like 5 or 6 years. If I use VCA style on the drum bus, which I occasionally will actually have a dedicated compressor as an insert on the actual drum bus, then in that case, I typically drop it down to 10, and I like the way that sounds on an individual drum bus. But on the mix bus, I like the movement. I just love punch. I mean, like you can tell when I soloed those parallel compressors on drums, like that just gets me so excited hearing that sound.
Yeah, they kick your teeth in.
Yeah, so I'm just looking for more of that. And then maybe again, that's like balancing out some of my natural tendencies with other areas of mixing. Where I also like big, solid, fundamental bass, so that those things kind of tend to override some of the movement forward and backwards of a mix. So I just try and bring it back with the mix bus. But it's pretty subtle, like I could turn this off and the mix isn't going to fall apart by any means. No. It's just doing a little bit, just kind of providing a little excitement, a little glue, a little depth.
Yeah.
And then by all means, if you want to hear any of these in isolation, let me know. But I'll just keep on going through things in the meantime.
Inflator.
Yeah, a little inflator, which I don't always use. I'm only using 6% on this mix, so it's like really subtle. And then this is, I think, the acoustic audio version of essentially the SSL Fusion. And it's kind of funny because I just bought an SSL Fusion. It's actually in my mix bus. Yeah. But now I just use them both, So it's just a tiny bit of the drive and a tiny bit of the EQ, and it's just kind of part of my template. And the real hardware unit has just been additive, and I don't feel like they're fighting each other, so I haven't removed it as of yet. But they're real subtle, and it's just one more layer of saturation. And then I'm actually not even using an EQ, so they're at unity now. I could probably turn this off, maybe to add some color. I'm not sure.
Sure.
And then another one of these guys. So this is kind of like my, my AI section of the mix bus. So I got a little bit of soothe, handling some of the final resonance. And at this point, I'll crank up the oversampling and the resolution pretty high to make sure we're going full quality on the mix bus. And then a bit of Gulf Foss Master.
Wow.
Which is pretty similar to the standard version. I've got it at 35 now on both sides. This varies depending on the project, just kind of whatever it does. Still don't know exactly how to describe these two functions. It's kind of one of those things you just got to get the plug-in and try it out and see how they react to different material.
It's incredible plug-in.
Yeah.
It really is.
It's awesome guys too. Really cool team. Really, really friendly developers. They sent me a coffee mug, so now I'm forever obliged to use it for the rest of my life. That's all it takes for me. And then virtual tape again, set to the 2-track mode. So all of the other instances of virtual tape are set to the 2-inch 16-track, where now we're on the 1/2-inch 2-track. And they're actually very different sounding. So that's a pretty key element. And I tend to, again, when earlier I would maybe mess with these settings a lot more, and lately it's like most of the time it's just here and on the FG9 tape style. I just like what it does. Again, add some saturation to the bottom end, kind of helps my low end find a pocket.
You keep that at 30 ips all the way, do you?
Yeah, I just leave it on 30 ips pretty much all the time. And this final few processors, again, this is kind of like an EQ, but it works with only additive distortion essentially. So it's like a parallel distortion EQ, but I feel like again it just adds vibe, and I can kind of decide exactly where I want to add that saturation. Saturation is probably a better word than distortion.
Yeah.
Gives you a few different modes, and then it's kind of been in my template, and it's variations of this. I'll tweak some of these, but they're all like very small amounts. Like none of these are over a decibel. And then usually my final chain is an Ozone 10. I really like the maximizer. Lately, I've sometimes been using that flatline 2 that I showed earlier on the drum bus.
Yeah.
I do like the hybrid mode. So I'm kind of like on every project now, I'm kind of comparing. I've just really got flatline 2, but I've been mixing into Ozone maximizer for 10 years, so I'm really familiar with how to hit it, and I like how it kind of adds a little bit of glue too. It's not so pristinely clean. It kind of saturates a bit in the way that I like, and you got a few different algorithms to pick from. I'm typically on balance, crisp or clipping. You can change your character, which is like essentially the release speed. It's got some features I like. I like being able to control the stereo independence of the processor, so I'll bring that down a bit to give me a little bit more width. And then there's usually some minor exciter on Ozone, a little bit of, this is where I'm going to add a tiny bit of overall stereo widening.
Okay.
Typically lately, I've been monoing everything out under 80 hertz.
Yeah.
And I use this tool that helps because a lot of stuff ends up on vinyl, so that helps with vinyl compatibility.
Yeah.
And I'm going to leave this area usually untouched again for vinyl compatibility. And then just widen these spots just a tiny bit more. And sometimes I'll move around the crossovers and just dial it in per project. But
So you're just widening a little bit from 600 hertz up and then just a little bit more from 7K?
both of these have set the same, yeah, so they're both at 15. But sometimes I would actually probably boost this one a little more. That's kind of where you can really feel the widening. I mean, 7K and up, if we solo this, it's like pretty much going to be overheads and sibilants. Let's see if are we getting anything out of this? There we go. No, we've lost it. What happened here? There it goes. So there's not too much to widen up there anyway.
No,
It's
sure.
so tippy top. But yeah, there's a good amount of meat here. There we go.
Yeah.
But again, going pretty subtle here. I think that over widened sound is kind of a bit overplayed these days.
Sure.
So try not to make anything sound like it's outside of the speakers or too non-natural, but a little bit. A little widening never hurt anyone right at this final stage here.
And the exciter, just one more time, that
Yep.
was just doing a little bit just a touch in each band.
Yeah, touching each band, and sometimes I'll dial this in a little more if I feel like I just need a little more saturation. You can almost use this, like the amounts here as like a bit of shaping at the very end.
Yeah.
And then again, like per project, I'm going to end up moving these bands around. But I really like specifically the tape saturation model on the Ozone exciter, and I actually run it in mid-side mode. And the mid and the side, actually look at these are off. Typically I run these the same, which I think they should have been here. I've just found a flaw in my session. And then I leave them linked. And then rather than stereo mode, I just kind of like the way it sounds in mid-side mode, even if they're both the same. But again, these are like, this is really get into the nitty-gritty subtleties of here. It's just kind of what I've put together in my mix bus.
And then on the maximizer, how many gate levels what's the sort of broad?
It sort of depends. Like I'm going to set a safe level of 0.3 dB ceiling with true peak on, just to keep the the Apple people happy with their mastered for iTunes or whatever. They keep on renaming it every year now, I feel like. And then obviously the threshold's just dependent, you know. I like a nice loud master, and I kind of like the sound of the Ozone Maximizer when you're smacking it pretty good. It's like part of my thing. I'm not so sensitive to like I'm fine with a loud master. But there's no need to like push it for loudness sake, just because the world is on streaming platforms now anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Like back in the day, you wanted your CD to sound louder than the next CD in your 5-disc changer, but like who has 5-disc changers anymore?
Absolutely.
And everyone's listening on Spotify or YouTube that are unifying for RMS anyway, so it doesn't really matter. You just make your choices pretty much based on the result, independent of volume. So.
And how many dB of gain reduction you're hitting on the maximizer roughly?
See where we're at now.
Yeah.
So we're still hitting RMS levels of like 5 to 6, so it's still pretty hot.
Yeah.
But we're not really needing to do much than shave off some of the snare peaks and the tom peaks and whatnot.
Do you look at LUFS metering when you're looking at your masters, or?
Not so much. For me, it's more of like referencing, which I don't think I actually have a reference set up in this project, but often I'll use like metric AB, and I'll have a few references up there, and I just need to make sure it's consistent with other mixes from the genre.
Sure.
I'm not really going for any kind of, you know, number.
No.
Yeah.
Just how it sounds.
Just how it sounds, yeah. And make sure it's not, you don't want it to be like much quieter than its, you know, mixed peers. And these days, like a lot of my reference mixes are my own mixes. You know?
Sure, yeah.
People are coming to me for a sound typically, so it's going to be like a few of my more recent mixes that are out and about in the world, and then a couple from the genre. Sometimes I'll bring in a few, you know, like competitors isn't the right word, but peers of the band and their genre to make sure it's like kind of fitting in that realm. But that's more or less just to keep my ears kind of in tune and to keep me honest and to keep me from getting too far off track. So I don't know if other people are like this, but it's real easy for me. If I just mix and mix and mix without references, I'll kind of like veer off to a realm where I'm like, oh man, this is way bright, or oh, this is way dark. It could be balanced within itself, but then you're kind of having to backtrack and master EQ things back into place. So especially when I'm in the early stages of a mix, or maybe the mid stages, I'll be referencing a lot to keep my ears honest, you know.
Dave Otero, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been fascinating.
All right, well, thanks for coming down.
Thank you, Dave.